For the last video, let's talk about how to incorporate feedback. Pyro is a very delicate system, and as you might already know, one little change, one little setting can throw everything off because everything relies on each other. For instance, if I do something that changes the temperature, that in turn will probably change the shredding. That shredding might then make me think that something's wrong with the source or something else. And so basically what can happen here is that you change one little thing and everything else gets screwed up. And this happens all the time with Pyro. So here is how to prevent that from happening. Here's how to adjust your workflow so that that doesn't happen to you. So pretend again that a client says, I want to change, I don't know, the thickness of the flames. Well, we know that the thickness can be due to many things. It could be due to the way things are sourced. It could be due to the divergence and how that's happening towards the base of the flame. It can happen because maybe we have too much shredding, and in that shredding, we're stretching this out too much or something like that. There's all sorts of things that can cause the flames to look too thin and for them to need to thicken up, as an example. So in that situation, here's what I would do. I would start off by disabling all my microsolvers. So I go like that. I would also create a brand new sparse pyrosolver node. I would detach this and then gray it out. So we still have all the settings right here. It's just off to the side. Then I would plug everything else in. And the idea here is that we want to start with the sourcing. We want to take a look at the client's notes and start with the sourcing and ask ourselves if the sourcing makes sense for what they want. So with that being said, we would go here to the Pyro source. I would start towards the top and I would just go node by node. Does this all make sense based on the feedback? Double check that, cache it out, bring it into the DOP.NET, and then see what it looks like. Do a little test render. The idea is that the sourcing alone should get you about 70% of what the sim ought to be. And so if it's not already in the general area that your client wants, then you need to keep adjusting the sourcing until it reaches that area. And then everything else is supposed to add on top of that. So let's say that we like the sourcing. It's all good. The next thing that I would do is I would take a look at the old pyrosolver. I would go through all these settings and I would one by one bring them in and do test renders. So you would check something here in the smoke, and then you'd go here in the smoke and you would do something like that. Go ahead and just go back and forth, do test renders, and double check as you go. If that all looks good, then you go and you add your forces. So you would start with turbulence. Turn this on. What does that do? Check your render. Do the same thing with the shredding. Do the same thing with the disturb. And the idea is that by adding on one by one all the various layers of the sim, you're going to start with what matters most, which is the source, and you're going to make everything stay in balance with each other without just randomly hopping around different settings. In order to visualize this, I made a pyramid which describes the order of importance when it comes to a pyrosim. And it looks something like this. Towards the bottom, we have sourcing. And sourcing, as you can see, makes up the majority of what you get from a simulation. If you don't have your sourcing right, then nothing else matters. The shading doesn't matter. What you do in comp doesn't really matter. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but for the most part, ideally, that doesn't matter. Temperature, shredding, turbulence, everything relies on the sourcing. And when you go to troubleshoot, that's the place that you start. After that is shading. And the idea is that if you have a sim that has the sourcing and the shading figured out, well, then that's probably something that you can at least work with to some degree. You know, it's not as ideal as getting everything on the pyramid correct, right? You want everything to be dialed in. But these two things are probably the most important thing in the very least. So you should spend a lot of time, or you should really make sure that these two things are correct before focusing on anything else. So as you're going along with the sourcing, try to ask yourself a few questions. And these are things that we've just covered in the course. So for one, are you scaling your objects to around 1 by 1 meters in size? You want that consistency in your workflow. You want the numbers to always be around the same areas so that you can keep control over what everything is doing from shot to shot. So that's a really important thing right away. Also, do you understand what you're trying to describe, or are you being intentional about the things that you're doing? You never want to just do something just for the sake of doing it. There should always be a reason for the things that you're doing. So, does this relate to something that you can observe in real life? Are you sourcing in areas that make sense? Do you know what the flame field is trying to achieve? What you're trying to achieve when you paint temperature in the middle? Try to think about those things in the sourcing, and that'll definitely help out your sim. Also, are you breaking up values with small, medium, and large noises? That's kind of what we see with that attribute noise and that being rasterized. Maybe if you have an issue with the sourcing, it could be in the way that the animation's happening on those noises. Those are things that you want to double check when you go to make any kind of change with your PyroSim. And then lastly, if you can utilize collisions with the sourcing, that'll usually make a pretty awesome impact as well. Next up is shading. So are you looking at reference? Is the reference appropriate? If you need to make a campfire, you shouldn't be looking at gasoline explosions as a reference. And so really be specific about the videos that you're using and make sure that that's appropriate for the situation. Also, what's happening behind the pyro? Because that makes a big difference, and so too does the lighting that the pyro lives in, especially when it comes to smoke shading. So being aware of all these things can help you troubleshoot with shading. And then velocity, I think, is where most people end up kind of making mistakes. The main thing that should drive velocity is temperature. It should not be turbulence. It should not be shredding, disturbance, anything else. The velocity mostly comes from the temperature, and everything else add on just a little bit of extra detail to give you the final thing. So really the key to this velocity is knowing what's ultimately pushing the vectors in the directions that they're going. How much is temperature affecting it? How much is that temperature in relationship to the turbulence right now in your sim? Do you know what your temperature is doing? Do you know what those values generally are? Are the control fields on the other gas microsolvers hitting that range that lives within the temperature field if you're using temperature? You can also use flame as well. But the idea is that you want to gain control over the velocity that starts with temperature and then it moves on to everything else. And then lastly, we have post effects, or you can also think of this as compositing. Now, here's the deal. A lot of times studios, they end up getting PyroSims that don't look very good. And when that happens, it's the guys in post effects, it's the compositing team that needs to cover it up with lots of motion blur, lots of bloom, lots of, hey, don't look over here tricks, right? To cover up a bad PyroSim. And that's really not ideal. And you really don't want to be in that situation in the first place. And it's not necessary if the simulation looks great in the first place. So, given that you have a good looking simulation, this post effects is just meant to add the little bit of extra push that already exists in your great looking sim so that it looks nice, it blends in great with the environment that's around it, and it just adds that little extra bit of feel, that last 20%, well, maybe that last 10%, let's say, of a subtle difference. So that is what you want with post effects. It's all about being tasteful. With post effects, you want to try to be as tasteful as you can. And when someone looks at your render, you want them to think that's fire rather than that's bloom. Or, oh yeah, that person just used a ton of motion blur. Whatever it might be. You want them to think about the thing that you made. And this now wraps up the course. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you've learned something and that you feel a lot closer towards creating Pyro that you're happy with, that you're excited about. I hope that these tips and tricks point you in the right direction at least, and that you can create awesome stuff. If you have renders, let me know about it because I want to share this stuff on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. I don't have Twitter and Snapchat. I probably should, but if you're on any of those platforms, let me know about it because I'd love to see what you guys are doing, and I think it's fun to share your progress with everyone else. Also, keep an eye out for Pyro 3. I don't know when that's going to happen, but at some point, I'm going to have this super epic trilogy of Pyro 1, 2, and 3. And in Pyro 3, I'll do like a huge explosion with missile trails and vorticles and all kinds of stuff that I haven't shown you yet. So that is down the line at some point. Also, I mentioned towards the beginning of this course that if you want to learn about the old Pyro solver, what I'll do for that is in the next section, you'll have a link that'll link you to the old version of this course. I don't think the old version turned out as good as this version did, honestly. I think that if you know the sparse Pyro solver, you don't necessarily need to know the way that the old one worked. But if you're interested in that, I have another 3 to 4 hours of me talking in that link. As always, thank you for your support. It goes a really long way. And until next time, I hope that you have a great day.